So I've decided for my own enjoyment and sanity, and maybe for somebody's utility out there, I do these little short video. I guess I call them a video essay. I don't know what exactly it is, but it's me talking through a concept, a bonsai concept that I've learned about and tried to figure out, and I think I've come to some understanding of it. And by putting it out loud, I'm hoping that some people will be able to tell me, oh, this is right, this is wrong, or they'll be able to say, oh wow, that's a helpful way of explaining that I was struggling with. And so there's a lot of different topics that I think I'll probably try to address with this. But the first one is one that I think is probably maybe the one of the more fundamental to how we approach bonsai, and also it's one of the more applicable across different levels of tree and levels of experience. And that's the difference between development and refinement. And I think that there is an abundance of information about what development generally and refinement generally mean. And so, but I'll give my own, overview of that. But I want to talk a little bit deeper, I think, about how I've experienced it so far. But generally speaking, development is the stage that your tree is going to be in if it's young. If there are significant things that you are trying to achieve in developing the tree, in other words, if you're trying to thicken the trunk, if you're really trying to thicken up branches, if you're trying to, in some ways you might think about it as a way of, repairing the health of the tree. I don't know if I would consider that being in development so much as being hands off with a tree that's struggling, but generally speaking, development is associated with lots more foliage, longer needles or bigger leaves, and it's associated with youthful tree, or it's associated with a tree that we're trying to, again, increase thickness and length, also to build up the vigor of a tree if you need to build some back buds, etc. Now that's on one end of the spectrum. I think sometimes we talk about it as if there's these two stages, and at some point you cross a line and you go from development into refinement. And I think it's just a spectrum, and I think most trees, with the exception of very, very young and very, very show ready trees, are in some degree of development in some parts and refinement in other. But before I jump into that, so refinement is on the other end of the spectrum. Refinement is what we think of as like the classical bonsai design, the look of the bonsai, where it's like with a maple or something like that. It's got all the really fine twigging. It's really beautiful. Or with a pine, for instance, the needles are very, very short, and they're all in proportion to each other. They're all kind of equal across the tree. Everything is very balanced. The thing about that is, if development is associated with speedy growth and aggressive growth and lots of foliar mass, refinement is ultimately about being slowed down. And I think that that's one of those aspects of the bonsai process of development, etc., that I didn't necessarily understand. So when you put a tree into a bonsai pot, an actual bonsai pot, not a nursery canister that has a lot of room, but a constricted environment, a small constricted environment. When you do that, the goals for doing that, obviously there is an aesthetic goal to that. The visual appeal of the bonsai pot, the small tree, small pot, etc., is really, really great. But there's also you're intending to constrain the growth of the tree. In general, the process of bonsai as a general concept is about restraining the growth of the tree. But part of the way that we do that is through pruning, but a major part of how we do that is through constricting the roots. So in other words, if you have a tree that is not close to the size that you want it to be, or the branches aren't nearly thick enough, or it has a big wound that you haven't healed yet that you really want to heal, the worst thing that you could do, just in terms of your goals for the tree, is to put it into a bonsai pot, because it's going to slow down. So that's the development versus refinement general conceptual thing. And it just took me a while to get my head around this. Not the basic concepts. I understand what I just said, and I think I understood that for a while. But if you think about like the natural environments that trees exist in, so think about like a field, a tree that grows maybe in a neighborhood, your neighborhood, or it grows in a field, or it grows in other areas where there's some rich soil. Early in its life, it grows really, really fast, and it actually keeps growing pretty fast up until the point where it somehow starts to reach the limits of where it can pull in resources. There's an abundant space for the roots. There's abundant fertility in most cases in the soil if it's a good situation. And in general, that tree is going to grow really, really quickly and develop really quickly in that kind of environment. Now, contrast that with the environments where we collect trees from, the places where these really cool Sierra junipers and ponderosa pines and things we see out west, or the really old Yamadori Japanese species from Japan and from Korea and from other places. Think about those environments that those things are growing in. The environment itself is really, really brutal, right? There's wind and snow and limited amounts of rain sometimes, and there's also, importantly, there is a very, very small amount of area for the roots to occupy. In other words, the field environment I was talking about is kind of like a nursery can or putting a tree in the ground and having it in development. It's an environment where you can develop a tree, and the other environment, the one where it's on the up on the mountain, the Yamadori environment that creates these really crazy gnarled trunks and other features, is more like a bonsai pot. That's why if I were to put a tree in that development context, if I were to put it in the ground or put it in a nursery can or put it in a field where it had really rich soil, and I were to plant that same tree, or it's a clone of that tree on that mountain, they're going to grow at very, very different speeds. And so that's the fundamental concept of development versus refinement, is how quickly does the tree grow, and how quickly do you want the tree to grow, based on how much room and resources it has to build bigger. And so I think that's not to say that covers all the techniques of refinement, but when you hear people say, oh, that's a refinement technique, well, one, something like pinching maples or pinching spruces or decandling Japanese black pines, or partial defoliation, things like that. In many cases, those are considered refinement techniques, and I'm not going to get into that right now, but the key part of that is the tree has to be in an environment where the energy is controllable in order to be in refinement as well. So it's not just about the techniques, it's also about whether or not that growth is constrained. So I think of it kind of as the nursery can, like the nursery container, the plastic container it comes in, or a wood box, or a Anderson tree flat, or tree band, or any of those things, along with a more organic mix. Those things are designed to, in a development stage, increase the speed of the development of the tree. And so it's the gas pedal. That's the technique. That's the growing condition where you're hitting the gas pedal. And so you can do things like you can put bends into the trunk. You can start considering branching and doing some minor pruning. But in general, when you're in development, your bread and butter is vigor and growth. And so you don't typically want to be removing a ton of leaf mass when you're in development. You typically don't want to be aggressively pruning off branches unless there are going to be obvious structural flaws, or there's a good reason to do that, because you're trying to build up the energy like crazy in that tree. I think a lot of this comes from the confusion around this comes from the fact that back in the day, like a long time ago, hundreds of years ago, most of the bonsai specimens were collected specimens. So in other words, the idea of development in the purest sense, in like the most fundamental growing the trunk sense, only really came along later once they started doing things like field growing trees for this purpose. And so there's the collected material, which does have development aspects, but it also has, mostly refinement. A lot of the trunk stuff is already done by the time that collected material is in your hands. But for the most part, it's a refined tree that you're going to be doing refinement on. So I think if you're starting a tree from seed, for instance, I started a tree from seed. I've started a lot of trees from seed in the last couple of years, and they are in full-on development. Now, I will put bends into the tree, into the trunk, and maybe even into some of those branches early on in their growth because I have control over that. But fundamentally, I'm letting those things grow like crazy. One thing I think that I wasn't sure about, and I wasn't, and so in some ways I guess I hoped it wasn't true, but I think it's very likely that if I want a tree of any substantial size or substantial thickness of trunk, I am probably going to have it in a nursery pot or in the ground or in some sort of non-bonsai container for 10 plus years. So that's just something straight up that I was not clear on early, and I've become clearer on now, is that you're going to leave it in a nursery mix with a nursery can with nursery mix of some sort. I do, for my trees that are in development, I got this from Eric Schrader at bonsai.com. I use a blend of perlite and cocoa coir, and I fertilize very aggressively into that. I think I do a pretty loose mix. So in other words, probably 60 to 70% perlite to 30 to 40% cocoa coir. And what that does is it doesn't create a real mucky mess in the root system. It's easier to clean the roots and kind of repot them and do all that kind of stuff. So most of my trees will be in that mix in a nursery can, 1 gallon pots, big stuff, for a long period of time. We want to put it into a bonsai pot. We got into bonsai to get to work on bonsai trees. But if you are going the route of getting younger trees or getting younger stock, you're likely going to have to develop it for a long time. Now, how do you know when it's ready to no longer be in the nursery can? Well, that's when the trunk is about as thick as you want it to be. It will continue to slowly thicken over its life, but very, very slowly once you put it in a bonsai pot. So if the trunk is as thick as you want it to be, the primary branches are about as thick as you want them to be, and you've got some secondary branching starting to develop, that's the point where you can take it out of the nursery can and then transition it to the bonsai container. So that's I think in our modern landscape, the equivalent of the collected tree might be that you go and buy nursery stock that has been in production for a number of years. It's kind of crazy sometimes, but like when you go and buy a tree that's of substantial size from a nursery and it's $50, $100, $150, lots of those trees might be 10 to 20 to 30 plus years old, which is really, really wild. But that's how they get the bigger diameter trunk and all of that. And so the nursery stock that is at the point where it's ready to become a bonsai in your estimation is maybe our modern example of the collected tree, and that's one that we could maybe take out of the pure development mix and put it into a bonsai container, if that makes sense. A couple points of clarification. One is that a tree can be in development, or a branch of a tree can be in development in a bonsai container. It's just that it will take a lot longer than it would in another context. And so there might be an example there of like you have a tree and 80% of the branches are ready to go into a bonsai container. You're going to start, doing whatever you're doing, decandling or partial defoliating on a deciduous tree. Once you put it into that bonsai container, if you have 1 or 2 branches, if you have 20% of that foliage or so, 20, 30%, something like that, that you want to lengthen still and you want to get a more aggressive back budding on and all that kind of stuff, you can treat the rest of the tree as if it were in refinement, and you can then prune the tree that's in or you can leave the part that's in development to just grow. Another point of clarification, I think when you are doing development, especially on very young trees, one of the things that you, at that point in the tree's life, are most responsible for, if the tree is going to ultimately be a bonsai, is making sure that you're setting it up to develop the best roots possible. Now, I mean healthy roots, but I also mean that Japanese buzzword of Nabari, the root flare, the parts of the visible structural roots there at the top where the soil meets the tree, gives the tree and the composition stability and strength and all those things. And when you are doing development, and this goes for whether you're growing in the field, whether you're growing in a nursery container, or somewhere along the spectrum of those techniques, you're going to need to take the tree out, do some root work. What I mean by that, and I'll show this spring when I start messing with it, is you're going to need to kind of tease out the roots a little bit, maybe do a little bit of trimming, certainly some reorientation. If there are some overly thick structural roots, you'll need to take those out. I'll get into that later, but you don't just put it in a growing pot and let it roll for however long until it's thick enough, and then pull it out and expect it to have good nabari, to expect it to have a good structural root flare. Those things take time and take work. And I think, to me, the root flare, root structure, noticing that and emphasizing that is one of the differences between people who don't really know anything about bonsai and people who have started kind of understanding the elements of the composition. People get caught up in the pot, and they get caught up in the cool branches and maybe something crazy with deadwood. But that root, I think a lot of the bonsai nerds out there focus in on that, and for good reason, because it does play a really important part in combining the two elements of the tree and the pot. There is a really cool podcast that Ryan Neal from Mirai did with the folks who used to run, or the folks who ran Telperion Farm until it burned down in some wildfires. And if you can't, it's not, I couldn't find it on Spotify for some reason, but it was back in 2018 they talked to them, and they kind of go through some of their process for field growing stock. But in their case, and they're able to grow things relatively quite fast for bonsai. So they would have a tree that looked much, much older, and it would only take 10 years, right, compared to what it might look like it was 30 plus years old. They go through a lot of their process there, but one of the things that they do, so I would say their trees are fully in development. They're at the almost at the far end of the development spectrum because they're in the ground. On the spectrum from fastest growth to slowest growth, you have in the ground, in a favorable environment, and then nursery container that's pretty big and pretty roomy, a nursery container that's a little more constrained, and then a bonsai pot is at the far end of the spectrum as far as slowing things down. So they were growing in the ground, but they were able to use these root control bags things to keep the roots in, so that they could eventually, when it was time to take them out of the ground and then move them on to toward a refinement management style, there were some smaller, more fibrous roots in around the trunk of the tree. There's a lot more to all this stuff than what I've talked about so far, but I just think the general concept and the ballpark timelines that was put on things was helpful for me once I kind of figured it out. So in other words, well, you say it's in development. How long is a tree in development? Well, I think if it's a fast growing species, something like a maple or a Japanese black pine, it may not take as long to get to the size that you want it to get to. And so it may be in development for a shorter period of time. If it's something that grows a lot slower, it could take a decade or more to get to the size that you want. Now, if you just want to grow bonsai and you want to have small trees and you don't, you're just having fun, feel free to do that at any point. You just put it in the bonsai pot and start managing it in that way. But I think if you want something that's a little bigger, a little thicker, has more branching, has more, maybe more character, depending on how you look at that, then the development side of things, for a lot of us who are not going and buying trees that are ready to go into refinement, is probably going to take longer than you might have thought when you got into it. And so I remember when I got into this, I was kind of expecting within a couple of years to have a bunch of trees in small pots. And the reality is I only have a few, not because I have hundreds of trees, but the overwhelming majority of them are still in that development phase. And so it would be counter to my goals to move them into those bonsai pots, even though it would look really, really cool to have them in there. I hope that's clarifying in some way. I again just kind of putting my own words out there more than anything, but yeah. Let me know if any of that stuff doesn't make sense, or if you feel like I made a mistake or said something wrong. I'd love to hear that. Take care, and I'll see you soon.